Metal. As always, my name is Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, and my co-host is Chris K. 40 years ago, the L.A. Club scene was on the verge of exploding onto the mainstream. Bands like Dokken, Motley, Crue, and Quiet Riot were getting gobbled up by major label record companies looking to find the next big thing, while veterans like Judas Priest, Ozzy Osbourne, and AC were looking to maintain their relevance.
At the same time, new bands tired of the hairspray and makeup of the burgeoning glam scene began to make waves in the underground. The rising thrash metal scene that permeated the Bay Area as well as New York City would give birth to several influential independent record companies that would release debut albums from some of the biggest names in metal.
If you haven't guessed by now, we're referring to the year 1983, and what a year it was. Today, Chris and I are going to talk about some of the events of 83 and talk about some of the metal albums that had a huge impact on the scene. And at the end, we'll give you our big four albums of 1983. So Chris, 1983. So we're literally going backwards in time because we were in the grunge scene a few weeks ago, and we did a in-depth analysis of the grunge scene in Seattle. But now we're heading back to the beginnings of thrash metal, when the L.A. scene, the glam metal, was starting to get big. And 83 was an important year to that, I think.
What's kind of interesting is, so the grunge scene was born out of that kind of distaste for what hair metal was as well. And so this, almost 10 years earlier is the same thing. So the people that didn't fit into that category, that didn't want to wear makeup, didn't want to tease their hair, they just wanted to go play music, is that same kind of attitude, but well before.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting. So glam people were pissing everybody off for years.
I'll tell you, if I had been born during that time, there's no way I would have been glammed out. Just, that's my personality. I would have never done that. I would have been part of the thrash scene, or I don't think I would have been part of grunge. I would have been thrash all the way.
Well, the funny thing about that is that, obviously I grew up right in the middle of this. And
yeah.
I was a teenager when all this is starting to go down. And glam, it's weird. Like I was a big Kiss fan, and I would wear Kiss makeup because I got the official Kiss makeup kit, which was really good stuff. Like the shit that they sell nowadays is like kiddie fucking makeup compared to what they sold. They sold legitimate Kiss makeup back in the late 70s, and that was a kind of like the white did not run. None of the colors ran. Like when you sweat, it was good stuff. And then, I didn't get into all the hairspray and the teasing of the hair and wearing a base layer of makeup. I never got into that. But I liked the bands. I mean, I liked Poison. I liked Motley Crue. I liked Cinderella, but I didn't get into their look per se, except for one time. And I actually showed the band this at one time. So in 1987, I graduated high school. We had our prom earlier in the year, or earlier in 1987, before graduation, obviously. And my girlfriend and I at the time, we went down to New York City, and we were looking for an outfit for me to wear to the prom. So it had to be tuxedo-like, but at the same time, she wanted it to be different. Like, she knew how I was, and she totally encouraged everything. So we ended up getting a tuxedo jacket, but it was one that went down to my knees, and it was made of not silk, but that silky kind of satiny, silky material, and it was black, and it had a gold pipe around all the stitching. And then it had the captain's tassels on the shoulders, right? And then we put some spikes on it, and we painted the spikes gold. And then I did up my hair like I was Jeff Tate from Queensryche, with a little point and a little push up on the sides a little bit. And that was the only time I could sit there and say that I did the whole pomp of glam metal. And funny thing was, I was emulating Queensryche, which at the time was technically not glam, but they glammed themselves up because that was what you did in 1985, 86.
Well, I mean, I get that. That's like a special occasion, though. It's not like you every day.
Right. I did not do it every day. Every day was, I looked like a regular thrasher. I had a leather jacket with spikes on, or a jacket with a painting on the back, and or a denim jacket, and that was it. And jeans and sneakers. I pretty much the way I dress now. And I did not go into that whole, teasing the hair thing. My hair, the humidity killed my hair anyway, so it just poofed up by itself. So it was one of those things where I didn't like the glam part of glam, but I liked the music.
But that was essentially what a lot of the thrash guys did, where they liked certain aspects of the music, but wanted a little bit harder edge and didn't like dressing up. So they just went on stage with their regular clothes.
All right, well, let's get into a little bit of this 1983 stuff. So let's take a look at some of the bands that formed in 1983.
All right, so who started in 1983?
So some of the bands that started in 83, Alcatraz with Graham Bonnet and Yngwie Malmsteen on guitar. That was a little short-lived, but nonetheless, Alcatraz started that year.
Very short-lived.
Well, for
Alcatraz was around a bit longer, but Yngwie would move on quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Bon Jovi started that year. They formed that year. A band named Lillian Axe formed that year. Lizzie Borden, for those people who are into a little bit harder than your normal glam. L.A. Guns, the first original one, not the three that are existing or two that exist right now. Technically, Megadeth started that year. Poison started that year. Possessed, the Red Hot Chili Peppers started that year. Samhain started that year, or some people know them as Sam Hain and Glenn Danzig's post-Misfits band. Stryper, a band named Legacy, started that year, which would eventually turn into Testament. Trickster, Warrant, and White Lion all started in 1983.
There's a couple more.
Okay, give me some more.
Death formed in 1983. Bathory. So if you're more familiar with the black metal scene, Bathory formed. Fate's Warning. We haven't really talked a whole lot about them in our time, but maybe sometime we should. Mayhem, if you'll remember, the most notorious band in black metal, and Halloween, and Metal Church.
Metal Church. I thought that was 84. Well, I guess not.
It formed together in 83.
We just talked about them a few weeks ago.
We did.
Because they weren't,
as well as Morbid
They weren't
Angel.
on my list. That's why I was.
Yeah. Morbid Angel. That was another band I think we've mentioned a couple times.
Yeah, we did a death metal episode, so
yeah.
They were there. I did not. So the list I had didn't have. I guess the list was a little less hard than yours.
Yours was a little more mainstream.
Yeah, I see Death now. I didn't even realize it. I kind of skipped right over the list I was looking at, that name. So yeah, and then another band that started that we're going to talk about a little bit was Fastway. That was Pete Way and Fast Eddie Clark. So that's how they came up with the name Fastway. And so they were cool, just like a straightforward. They weren't as heavy as Motorhead, but it was straightforward, heavy blues rock. Very heavy blues rock, but for pretty cool nonetheless. They had a breakthrough success with the song Say What You Will, and then they had the Trick or Treat soundtrack later on.
I guess it's better that they came up with Fastway than like Fast Pete or or Clark Way.
All right. We're going to go over some of the albums that came out this year and kind of give you some details about those albums. So here we go. What do you got first?
So let's talk about Dio let's give him the first slot here. So Dio, obviously had come from Rainbow, had some time in Black Sabbath, and now was doing his own thing. So he forms a band, which he gets actual pretty much full control of because he's the producer of for their first album, and that's Holy Diver. It was released in May 25th of 1983 on Warner Brothers Records, and that was Vertigo in the UK and Mercury in Europe and Japan. They recorded at Sound City Studios in Van Nuys. Is that how you say that?
Van Nuys,
California. And produced, like I said, the album was produced by Ronnie James Dio. So part of the reason he broke up with Black Sabbath, as it's been told over the years, was that during the recording of their Live Evil album was that basically Ronnie would do one thing when he was in the studio, and then Tony would come behind him and change the settings afterwards, and they would go back and forth, and they were having a lot of dispute over those things. There was the issues that they had just had that were building up over time, and this was his chance to strike out on his own. And for an album that, basically it was his opportunity to become a man of his own, it's fantastic. I mean, I would say it's on a lot of top 10, a lot of top 20 lists that have come out over the years. I know Kerrang gave it like a perfect melodic metal album, description when it came out. It's a 10 over 10 for Collector's Guide to Heavy Metal. It's one of those albums that to me is a perennial classic. You got Holy Diver, Stand Up and Shout, Rainbow in the Dark, Straight Through the Heart, Don't Talk to Strangers. I mean, just absolute classics of songs. And it would continue his relationship with Vinny Appice, who would be his drummer for many more albums. They first worked together on Mob Rules. So I absolutely love this album. What do you think?
Oh, the album's great. I mean, it's a classic, without a doubt. The first time that I heard anything from the album was when MTV played the video for Rainbow in the Dark. And you see this guy who's dressed a little bit like someone that's coming from, the Renaissance Fair. and it's funny because that inspired so many people in the 80s to wear those like moccasins that tie all the way up to the top of your calf. It was just such an odd way to dress. But anyway, I'm not going to get into it because I'm pretty sure there's someone listening out there to us that dresses like that, and I don't want to offend them.
So my first experience was very similar, but it was on VH1 Classic. So I saw the Holy Diver video, and I see him, stomping through a castle, and he's swinging this sword around, kind of like hitting guys that are like, you never see him directly hit anybody, right? Camera angle changes every time. And I was like, who is this dweeb, but by the end I was like, the music was so good, like I couldn't deny it. It was kind of corny, it was kind of cheesy, but I loved it. And I love the music video for it. Like it by the end of 4.5 minutes, it sold me.
Oh yeah, I mean Holy Diver itself, that song is awesome. There's something about that song that just it's like, it's not like a build because it's a pretty like straightforward plodding metal song, but it's got such a good hook and a good melody to it. And that was the thing about metal in the 80s. To succeed, you had to have a hook, you had to have good melodies. Something's changed along the way a little bit later on, where good hooks or good riffs replace good hooks, and then a basic kind of chorus replaced the very melodic choruses. But it wasn't for the negative per se, because a lot of that music is kind of what other forms of or genres of metal, derived from, but it definitely went from being very, very melodic to very heavy and a little bit different in terms of melody and hookiness. But anyhow, Holy Diver was just fantastic. I mean, Stand Up and Shout hooked me right away. Like you were mentioning, Holy Diver. Gypsy is pretty cool. Rainbow in the Dark, obviously, was a really cool song. And that's a funny thing because that was a big hit for him and really is what put him on the map. And that was a throwaway. He didn't want to do that song. He thought it was corny sounding. He thought it was cheesy. And it ends up being, one of his biggest hits early on. So that's...
To hear anything like Dio saying being cheesy, it's just like, well, that's extra cheese.
Yeah, because he's high on the cheese factor.
Yeah, we love him for it.
No, I mean, like you said, Ronnie grabbed his career by the horns, and he took off with this album. So, and it was a fruitful relationship for the band for 3 albums, and then business matters got in the way, and Vivian Campbell was he either quit or he was fired. I think he was straight up fired at that point because I don't think he actually wanted to leave. So they just showed him the door, or Mrs. Wendy Dio showed him the door.
Yeah, they never really patched up their differences, unfortunately.
No, unfortunately not. Okay, so let's pick another album from this year that we want to talk about. And for me, I'm going to go ahead and talk about Twisted Sister and You Can't Stop Rock and Roll. That came out this year. That album was released in May of 1983 on Atlantic Records, and it was recorded at Soul Studios in Cookham, England. And it was produced by renowned producer Stuart Epps. So Twisted Sister basically was a veteran of the New York City tri-state area. And tri-state, for those who don't know the area, is New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Or is it New York? No, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut is the tri-state area. And Connecticut being really on the outskirts towards the north. They were veterans of the club scene, New York, New Jersey. They've been playing there at this point, come up to 1983, almost 9 years. And they could not, for the life of them, get themselves a record deal. Well, in 1982, that changed. They went to England. They got a deal after playing some shows out there with Secret Records. Released an EP. They released their first album, Under the Blade, and then Secret went bankrupt like literally overnight. Luckily enough, they had enough of a groundswell and enough of an underground following in England that Motorhead and Lemmy specifically took a liking to them, and Dee Snider and Lemmy had a famous friendship over the years, and because of Motorhead's basically giving them the thumbs up, people like Twisted Sister. So they got signed to Atlantic Records. They released You Can't Stop Rock and Roll. And they actually had a pretty decent hit in the song I Am I'm Me that reached number 19 in the UK singles chart. That album, I mean, you and I did a Twisted Sister's Greatest Hits, but I don't think we did a head-to-head. And the Greatest Hits, I mean, we picked out some songs, and this album has some good tracks on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really not bad. I'm not the biggest fan of Twisted Sister because you hear a drummer like AJ Pirro who's so talented, and I always feel like he's just held back by the songwriting. I feel the same way about a lot the musicians in the band as a whole, and I don't know, there's something about that really bothers me, like, while I'm listening to it. But you can't deny they have some really great classics. And this is not a bad album by any means. This is probably one of the best Twisted Sister albums, period.
I mean, the song "You Can't Stop Rock and Roll" was a hit on MTV. I mean, there's definitely the one thing that Twisted Sister was known for was their, in some cases not so subtle, but they had some subtle comedy in their videos. And this one had it because, the guy puts on headphones and all of a sudden the music's too loud and it blows up in his ears. And then he basically, dies from listening to Twisted Sister.
What a way to go.
I mean, it's funny. They waste them there at the end of the video. But then of course everyone knows what's happened with I Want to Rock and with,
We're Not Gonna Take It.
We're Not Gonna Take It. Yeah. So that's the style of video that they started putting out. But even then that changed. But for the most part, I mean, I think they put a video out for Leader of the Pack, another comedy video. So that's part of the problem that Twisted Sister had. Excuse me. That's part of the problem that Twisted Sister had, was they were kind of lumped into this a comedy routine, really, and some people didn't take them seriously. You and I both are wrestling fans, and that's one thing that I know that you don't like so much is the comedic wrestling. And to me, that's what kind of happened to Twisted Sister. No one took them seriously. They weren't taken as serious musicians.
Yeah, they had talent, but it's like it's overlooked because of their gimmick.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but this album was pretty cool. I mean, it's one of my favorite albums by them. I mean, they don't have that many, but I mean, one distinct thing I remember when Stay Hungry became a big hit in 1984. That's when I discovered this album. So I didn't discover this album immediately in 1983, but after I became a fan of Twisted Sister, I picked up this album, and this album, man, I played the crap out of this album. I remember hanging out at my buddy's neighborhood. He lived in an apartment, and then right in between that apartment and the building and the next apartment building, and these weren't big. These were like, just 5-story kind of like just large apartments. They weren't like a projects or anything like that. Right in between there was a parking lot, and there was an abandoned car, and I think it was like some sort of Jeep type thing or something like that, or may have been a van. I can't remember, but we used to hang out in that thing all the time, and you think about it now, like that's not something I would ever think about doing nowadays, right? So,
yeah.
But, we're in there, and, there's however many countless people were sitting in that chair in the driver's seat and the passenger seat. Now I think about it, it was a van, because I remember that big console in the middle where the engine bay is really at inside a van. And we were just cranking, had my boombox. We're cranking Twisted Sister all the time. So that's my distinct memory of that album back in the day. And this is 1984, 1985. So I'm 15, 16 years old at this time.
There's always something so kind of refreshing when you think about those moments and like when you first listen to an album, etc.
All right, so what do you have next?
All right, so kind of going back to the band that Dio just came from, let's talk about Black Sabbath with their 1983 album, Born Again. So released on September 12th, 1983 on Warner Brothers Records. The same Warner Brothers Records that released Dio's album, which I thought was kind of interesting, and Vertigo Worldwide. This was recorded at Manor, Oxfordshire, England. So this was produced by Robin Black and Black Sabbath. So one thing that I think is very interesting about this is that basically, they had Ozzy in the band, who became absolutely iconic over these, ever since. Finally just retired this year. Who knows if that's going to be permanent? We don't know. There could always be one more moment, right? So then they go to Dio and release Heaven and Hell. It's an absolutely amazing album. They release Mob Rules, and then essentially the band breaks up over a live album. So not a very long tenure with the band, and their future was really in doubt. They've lost Bill Ward, they've lost Vinny Appice, they've lost Ronnie James Dio. So, they need to kind of reform in a way. For this album, they got Bill Ward back, and they were kind of discussing different singers. They were trying to figure out, what direction they want to go. They had considered Robert Plant, which I think is absolutely crazy. They considered David Coverdale. Can you imagine David Coverdale with Black Sabbath?
Yeah, no.
Not at all. Do you know who else auditioned for Black Sabbath at this time?
Who?
Michael Bolton.
Really?
Yeah.
Michael Bolton. Well, that goes along the lines of David Coverdale.
Yeah.
You know?
I think it's that was pretty interesting. I would love to hear that audition.
Oh, jeez. I can't even imagine that.
And so they ended up with Ian Gillan of Deep Purple. So what a weird story this is. So basically they suggested it. They signed it. They did it. They never rehearsed together. They never tried anything out. They start on the tour, and Ian Gillan thinks this was a mistake. So it really didn't last long. It was a very short tenure of this lineup. I think everybody likes each other, or liked each other even then. It didn't click in the way they thought it might. And I still think the album was really good. I like it a lot. And the first song that I heard from it was Trashed. Actually, that's not correct. First song I heard was Zero the Hero and the Dark Instrumental. And I thought that was really cool. I really like that song. And the first time I heard it was in a compilation with mostly Ozzy stuff, and there was at the end there was Dio stuff, and it did not say on the inner or the liner stuff that came with the copy that I had that it was, or like who sang the songs. Like they didn't list anything. And I don't know if maybe I had a bootleg or something like that, but I was like, man, Ozzy sounds weird. Like I legitimately did not realize that it was somebody else. Like I was like, what is this? He sounds so bizarre, And I was very young when I first heard it, and then I learned later that it was Ian Gillan. I say, okay, that makes 1,000 times more sense. And then I heard Trashed, and I was like, I got to buy this album. I mean, obviously, like Zero the Hero and Trashed are awesome. I got it, and it's still really good. Like Digital Bitch is a really cool song. Disturbing the Priest, Born Again itself. I like the album. I don't think it works as well as some of the others, I guess. But I certainly like it. For me, I like it more than the Tony Martin stuff. And I don't like it as much as Dio, but I still think it's a really solid era of the band, in my opinion.
It's definitely a different take, This is what happens. This is the end results of a drunken stupor that Tony and Ian get into, and Tony's like, hey, you want to join the band? And Ian's like, well, yeah, sure. Why not?
Let's do it.
And then all of a sudden, the next day, Ian's manager's like, can you kind of let me know when you plan on joining another band? That way I can at least have a little bit of advance notice before I get paperwork I'm supposed to sign. It's like, what?
I mean, so there's some conflicting stories there, but I think the more prevailing one now is that they were going to essentially form a new supergroup. But what's his name? Sharon's dad, Don Arden, was basically like, no, you're Black Sabbath.
This is the same guy who said, no, we don't want Ronnie James Dio in the band. He doesn't have any fucking sense. I don't know how the fuck he stayed a manager, for as long as he did, making the fucking worst decisions you could possibly make. And then everybody going, you know what, Don, we're not going to do that. We're not listening to you. It's a good thing because, he just sat back and collected his fucking royalty checks and his payments, man. It's like, shit, really? It's like, come on.
Well, one thing I can tell you is that album cover probably really helped the album sales.
Yeah. This album was odd, but I liked it. Like when I first saw Trash, I thought this is really cool because I had heard of Ian Gillan because at this time Deep Purple had already been broken up for a few years as a group. Ian had already been out of the band for 8 years or so at this point, maybe 9. And so it was a matter of Ian was doing his solo thing. So I knew he was a singer for Deep Purple at one point. I had heard his voice. He's got an amazing voice. And to know that he was going to be in Black Sabbath, and, Black Sabbath got back together with Bill Ward. I mean, all that stuff was kind of like not something that was really talked about. Like, oh, it's not, the original members of Black Sabbath with new singer Ian Gillan. It wasn't like that. It was just kind of, this is Black Sabbath. They have another singer. The third one, technically maybe four, if you want to consider that one little guy that was there for, half a day between Ozzy and Ozzy.
Dave Walker,
yeah, that guy. So, knowing all that, I mean, you could tell. I mean, you got great musicians and you got a great singer. Did it work? On record, it worked. And when you listen to the songs, I mean, like Digital Bitch might as well be a Deep Purple song, just with really, really heavy distorted guitars, like way past anything Ritchie Blackmore typically did, but for the most part, that whole melody of him in the vocal melody that he's doing easily could have been something off of Machine Head, because that's just the way it sounded. It's like something like Highway Star almost. But Trash was good. Digital Bitch was good. Zero to Heroes is heavy and menacing and plotting. Disturbing the Priest there's a little bit of trying to be progressive that just, for me, when they got away from that progressive part of the song, it worked better. But that whole off time kind of thing was just not working for me. But otherwise, the album sounded like shit. I don't know how you felt about it, but like it was just so muffled sounding, and it still sounds like that today.
It's not perfect, but I still like it. It has a mood to it, and I thought this was interesting. So, so a couple people thought it was either their favorite or one of the best albums, and that was Chris Barnes from originally from Cannibal Corpse and then 6 Feet Under, and Lars Ulrich thought it's one of Black Sabbath's best albums. And this song, or the song Zero the Hero, has also been cited as inspiration for Paradise City from Guns N' Roses, which I think is pretty crazy.
Out of all those things that you just mentioned, the most obvious one to me is the Lars Ulrich connection, because he's a huge Purple fan.
Yeah,
I get that. I can see that. Everything else, I mean, maybe Chris Barnes, he's just a weird dude. But the whole thing with Paradise City, I don't see the connection there whatsoever. But hey, if that's what they felt inspired them, by all means.
I don't think it means inspired like they did a 1-to-1 copy. I think it was more like just like inspiration. Yeah, exactly. So, it's one of those things like the tour didn't go very well. They basically Bill Ward didn't tour. He had to go back to rehab, and Bev Bevan came in and played with him. So it was kind of doomed to fail from the beginning, just to be honest. But I still think it's a pretty great album, and I still put it up there above some of the stuff that came later.
The back cover of the album's very, very Black Sabbath. That is such a typical Black Sabbath kind of look on the back cover.
Yeah.
Front cover, I don't know what the hell's going on with that front cover.
It's a red demon baby. It's pretty normal.
Yeah, you see that all the time in advertising and everything. All right. Enough fun of Black Sabbath for now. We're going to move on to one of the biggest albums that come out that year in terms of total overall record sales, and that's going to be Quiet Riot's Metal Health.
I thought you were going to say Virgin Steel. Damn it.
Man, I'm sorry. That's not going to happen later either. All right, so Quiet Riot had been around the scene for a while. They released 2 albums in Japan. Randy Rhoads was their original guitar player. They kind of broke up, and then they kind of got back together, but Randy was not part of the band. Anyhow, basically, they didn't get back together. Kevin resurrected the band.
That's a new formation of the band, honestly.
Yeah, with Randy's blessing, he reformed Quiet Riot, and shortly thereafter, they got signed to Pasha Records, and so Metal Health was released on March 11th, 1983, released on Pasha, like I just said. It was recorded at the Pasha Music House in Hollywood, California, and it was produced by Spencer Proffer. So this album was probably the biggest, quote-unquote, heavy metal album of 1983. And I say it that way because there were some big albums in there, but this one did a lot. They had two big hits off of it, which was Come On Feel the Noise and Metal Health. It is the second heavy metal album to reach number one on the Billboard 200 album charts. And it's the first being AC/DC's For Those About to Rock, which came out 2 years earlier. Come On Feel the Noise reaches number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. And that song was certified gold for the sale of more than 1 million units in 1984. Now, the significance of that is that it wasn't until 1989 that they changed the threshold for singles and reduced it to 500,000 units. So essentially, that single for Come On Feel the Noise is a platinum single by today's standards. And a weird little tidbit on this, Rudy Sarzo actually did not play on Metal Health or the song Metal Health or the song Don't Want to Let You Go, as those two were recorded before Rudy joined the band. Chuck Wright, the other bass player, he was in the band and ended up leaving, and so Rudy came in, ended up playing on the rest of the album, but not those two songs.
That's an interesting statistic too. Is like, so Chuck Wright had 4 tenures in Quiet Riot. Rudy Sarzo has 4 tenures in Quiet Riot. Both bass players. So they just couldn't keep anybody consistently.
Well, it's funny because Chuck Wright is the one who just left to allow Rudy Sarzo to come back and take over the band.
Yep.
And that's a weird thing. I'm glad, in that respect, I'm glad that Rudy's there, putting the band through now, because without Frankie, as much as Chuck Wright has a tremendous amount of legacy with the band, in reality, no one really knows who he is as far as Quiet Riot is concerned. They know the name. They know he's played, but he wasn't the guy on the videos. He wasn't the dude licking the freaking bass strings, okay, playing upside down. That was Rudy Sarzo, and Rudy is the one who's become synonymous as the bass player for that band, regardless of how much time Chuck has put in or Rudy's put in. So I'm glad that he's there now in charge of the band, if for anything, because realistically, I mean, they're playing small, little, tiny clubs, and I don't know how much longer that band can actually continue to be what they would think is a relevant band.
I think they ought to get Paul Shortino back.
He might need a gig. And so one last thing about this album, it's funny because this album, Metal Health, was the first appearance of that metal mask that ended up appearing on almost every single album from the band from that point forward. I think maybe 1 or 2 tops it did not appear on, but it had some sort of resemblance to that cover or to that metal mask on every single album after that.
That's true. I mean, this is a new version of the band, essentially, right? So it would make sense that would be the start of their mascot. I think a lot of people outside of Japan really didn't know who Quiet Riot was prior to around this area. And, I mean, around this era is what I meant to say rather than area. But, yeah, this was a huge album. It crossed over into mainstream, and that was huge for metal. Like them putting out this album made record companies go, we need to sign as many metal acts as possible, and it kind of created the boom of the metal scene at that time.
And it's funny because that's exactly what Kevin DuBrow told everybody who came in contact with him. If it wasn't for us, nobody would have been signed. But the funny thing is, the funny thing about that is, Motley Crue and Dokken were signed before that.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like, what are you talking about, dude?
No,
but that was the whole thing. He ran himself into so much verbal trouble.
Yeah, no, there would still be bands that were signed, but it increased the amount for sure.
Oh no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, he Quiet Riot had much more initial success than Don Dokken, much more initial success than Motley Crue, but we're going to talk about them a little bit later. But they had an album that came out this year too, 1983. So, and it was pretty big for them, but not as big as this.
Not
one.
as big as Kevin made it seem.
Exactly.
Yeah, he had some clashes with people over the years.
He clashes with. I remember the whole thing with David Lee Roth, and David Lee Roth talking about how when he drank Jack Daniels, it wasn't tea sitting inside the bottle. It's like back
I heard
and forth.
that in Dave's voice when you said it. When I drink tea.
Anyway, all right. So what's the next album you got?
So let's talk about a little band from Texas. Now, I'm not talking about ZZ Top.
Band from Texas. Oh, I thought we were talking about ZZ Top.
No, I do love the album they released this year. That would be Eliminator. But I didn't really feel like ZZ Top was a band that we would typically talk about. So I'm talking about Pantera.
Pantera?
Yeah, back in '83. So I'm sure everybody knows this little tidbit at this point, but there was a time when you would say Pantera in '83. Well, that doesn't make sense. But yes, they had their glam era, which started when they were all very young. Basically, this album was, Vinny and Daryl putting together a project. They met. They met Terry Glaze in college, from what I understand, or at least in the scene around there, and they basically, Terry Glaze had a band, and he wanted Vinny to be part of it because he was such a good drummer, and Vinny said, "We're a package deal." So they had two guitarists, which was Terry at the time, and Vinny. I'm sorry, and not Vinny, and Daryl. So when their singer that they were rehearsing with left, then Terry Glaze moved over to vocals, and then they had Rex Rocker at the time on bass. This is a very, very, what's the best word? Independent album.
Independent it's beyond independent. This is like self-released.
Yes.
That's real independent.
Yes. Jerry Abbott, their father, was the producer along with the band. He was such a encouraging force on them as musicians. Like, I can't remember which brother it was, came home with a tuba from school, and he said, "Take that back and learn a real instrument." So I believe it was Vinny, because Vinny picked up the drums, and then not shortly after, Daryl picked up the drums, and Vinny was progressing way faster. So he said, he said to his dad, "Can you buy him a guitar so we can play together?" And then they went from there. If you listen to Metal Magic, man, it's very rudimentary. You can tell that they have a long way that they'll go, but for a first album from a very young band, in their teens, this was really a lot better than some of the other stuff that was coming out at the time. Honestly,
it was on par with Dawkins Breaking the Chains.
Maybe. I don't think so, but
no, I'm just kidding.
Okay. I mean, like in some capacities, yeah. Like you can tell Daryl early on, his solos are really good. Like even if the songs don't have great hooks and they're not really catching on very well here, like Daryl has moments of greatness on this album, to be honest. And Vinny's drumming is really good. It's just they still have further to go. Like they this is the base level for them.
Oh no, absolutely. This being their first album. Now, mind you, at this time, Dimebag is 17 years old. Vinny's 19 years old. They're still teenagers. They're still, getting their feet under them in terms of, their musicianship. But they're already light years ahead of a lot of other musicians. And because their dad encouraged them so much, that's pretty much the biggest reason why. I mean, they just had this tremendous amount of support to be able to do what they wanted to do. So they put this band together. This album is not bad. It is absolutely raw in its rawest form. It is great it's got hooks in it. Are they the best hooks? Are we talking Poison style hooks? No, but it's Poison style music. It's it's typical 80s glam, from a band that is just starting out, and it sounds like a demo. It's made like a demo. That's pretty much what this is, But they put it out as their first album because, damn it, we've got 10 songs and we're going to put it out, And
but they had a little bit of a following because of the club scene. They're playing, and they were becoming a big band, just from the stuff that they had at the time, which is really impressive.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the artwork leaves something to be desired, but that's a whole nother story for another time.
I mean, yeah, the artwork's been lampooned to death. I mean, it's like a naked cat dude with a belt on, no crotch, and the weirdest looking sword you ever saw.
It's not that he has no crotch. He's tucked away.
Well, he has an extra third set of abs in the middle of his abs too. So there's some definite anatomy problems, but let's be honest. Like, it was, a band that was putting this together as teenagers, just thought it looked cool. Didn't have money, I'm sure, to pay some artist to throw something together for them, and it did the trick for what it was at the time. I mean, Pantera gained a little bit of a scene for, where they were, and it got them to the next stage in their career when they wanted to be heavier. So, yeah, I mean, as funny as the album cover is, I would probably love to own it.
Oh, absolutely. I would totally love to own it. I mean, look, this is, you got to take it into perspective as well. This is 1983. Metal is glam metal, out of LA, out of New York. It's just really beginning to bubble over. And they picked up on it and they went with it. Mm-hmm. There's nothing wrong at all with this. I mean, this is, like I said, I listened to it the other day. Pretty good stuff, full of sexual innuendo. What do you want from a bunch of teenagers, really? Okay, this is exactly what a bunch of teenagers are going to put out. So
yeah, pretty much.
I dig it. I thought it was cool shit. I mean, it's
for what they would become. It's an interesting piece in time.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so what do you got next?
All right, what I'm going to come up with next is what at the time would probably still have been my favorite band. In 1983, that would be Kiss. And they released Lick It Up on September 22nd, 1983 on Mercury Records. It was recorded at Right Track Recording Studios, The Record Plant, Atlantic Studios, and The Hit Factory, all in New York City. And it was produced by Michael James Jackson, Paul Stanley, and Gene Simmons. Michael James Jackson not being the same person who put Thriller out, but this guy who produced Creatures of the Night. So anyhow, this album was released, well, actually prior to the album release, Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, Eric Carr, and Vinnie Vincent appeared on MTV, and they appeared unmasked, no makeup, for the first time in public to promote the upcoming album. And
how shocking was that?
And I'm glad you asked that because my next line in my notes says, I was in shock.
That's funny.
Okay, so, I mean, you asked a perfect question because in all honesty, I'm a 14-year-old kid whose favorite band is these four guys, is Kiss. And I've been through the lineup changes from Peter Criss to Eric Carr. I went from Ace Frehley to Vinnie Vincent. Did not know anything about the issues that they had because nobody knew about the issues that they had leading up to Unmasked, leading up to The Elder, leading up to Creatures. Nobody knew anything about that. All they just knew was Kiss was Kiss. And they, now you read stories way back from that day, and you hear or you understand that there was rumors. But as a 14-year-old kid, you didn't read that kind of shit. You just read a magazine. It was absolutely shocking, but at the same time, I'm like, oh yeah, that kind of does look like him. Ugly as fuck, but yeah, okay, I get it. I mean, they did not do themselves any favors, because they didn't really give themselves a look other than like they literally just like came off the train, and that's what they look like. Like Vinnie Vincent looked like ass at that point. He did not look good. Eric Carr kind of looked like himself. He had that big giant head of hair and a really tiny face, and when you see Paul, Paul's got those, sleepy bedroom eyes. Gene Simmons.
Eric was like 80% hair back then.
It was just all fucking hair. And he's all of like 5 foot tall. So, he's got a 3 foot hair.
Guy.
So he was all hair. But, and Gene Simmons, like you look at Gene and Paul and you say, yeah, okay, I can see it. I can see it now. But Gene, his hair was not the same. It's not like what it is now, but a lot better back then. It was shocking. But at the same time, yeah, okay, I get it, But yeah, as far as the album was concerned, that put Kiss back on the map. I mean, the whole thing of unmasking obviously was genius strategy. Now the question was
genius? Huh?
That's a good point. Now the question is whether or not they had the musicianship to back it up. Now, as a fan, you knew they did, right? The question was, as a non-fan, did you think they did? And they proved that they did. Okay. Album reached number 24 on the Billboard Top 200. They released 2 big singles off of the album, Lick It Up and All Hell's Breaking Loose. Lick It Up is virtually a standard today in their set list. All Hell's Breaking Loose is Paul's attempt at trying to be a rapper. And it's funny because it doesn't work, but at the same time, it's 1983, so it kind of works because you can see that, Paul's the white Jewish guy trying to rap. So
it worked for the Beastie Boys.
Oh, a lot better. All right. During the tour, Vinnie Vincent was fired. Actually, not during, but at the end of the tour, he was fired for personality conflicts. I mean, he just thought his shit didn't stink, and he wanted more money. He actually wanted the equal cut.
He wanted to be part of the band.
He wanted 25%. Actually, I think he wanted more because I think he wanted more than Eric. Like Eric was like a hired gun type of thing, and he had his salary, but it was pretty large. It was a pretty big cut, I'm sure. But Vinny wanted like cut of sales and merch and all that shit, and Kiss was like, "What? Are you nuts?"
He was trying to invade.
Yes, he was an invader.
You might even call it a Vinnie Vincent invasion.
Anyway, All Hell's Breaking Loose is one of 3 songs in the Kiss catalog, which the songwriting credits is given to all 4 members of the band. 4 members of the band at the current time. So at that time, it was Eric Carr, Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, and Vinnie Vincent. The other time is Kissing Time from the first album. And for the life of me, I forgot what the third one is. I think it's off a song off of Monster. So it was Tommy Thayer, Eric Singer, Paul, and Gene were credited on there. So that it was a good album. And when I listened to it the other day, there's some really good tunes on there, and some really good playing on there. I mean, Eric Carr is just playing his ass off. I mean, he's just a sensational drummer, and this album I thought was pretty good. I mean, have you listened to it recently?
I mean, not since we did one of our last Kiss episodes, but I do like it. I would say a couple songs come up on my playlist every once in a while. So I haven't listened to it in its entirety recently, but to me it's a classic as far as Kiss goes. Like you said, it revitalized the band, and Vinny's input in this time period I think is so important. maybe he was asking too much, and maybe there was the personality clashes. But Kiss owes a lot to staying alive at this point to Vinny, just to be honest.
No, I agree with you completely. But,
I know
there's only so much that you can ask for as a person who's been invited to be in the band.
100%. I'm not saying that he was right. I'm just saying, like, you have to look at it objectively as well and say, he really did contribute a lot at that time.
No, for sure.
So to me, I think this is a landmark album for the band, just because they had reached a point where the gimmick was no longer working of wearing the makeup, and the mystique was already kind of broken. Just losing 2 members of the band, having to replace them, and I think you can do that to some level, but at some point people start to lose interest. Some of the last few albums had not been what they expected either. Dynasty really, I think, turned off a lot of people from their sound, so this was a chance to be revitalized, and it worked to a great degree.
It definitely worked. The unfortunate part was that the album prior, Creatures of the Night, was 100 times better than this album. And this is still a good album. I mean, this is a platinum album, all right? Creatures of the Night should have been double, triple platinum. It's that good of an album. It's unfortunate because people were over the gimmick. And that's the biggest thing. Because even though the video for I Love It Loud that came out during that time was on MTV, it didn't get enough because MTV was over the gimmick. It really should have been bigger, and it's unfortunate. But the fortunate part was Vinnie Vincent still had some good songs in them. Helped Paul and Gene out tremendously, like you said, and this album is stellar. The musicianship is on it is good, and it put them back on the map, and it gave them a career in the 80s. That is for sure.
Yes, 100%.
All right, so what is your next album?
All right. Let's talk about a band that we really haven't focused on whatsoever. Let's talk about Crocus. Crocus released their 7th album in this year. This 7th, let me rephrase that because it sounded like they did 7 albums in 1 year. So they released their 7th album in 1983 on Arista Records, recorded at BJ Studios in Orlando, Florida, and this was produced by Tom Alom. So you probably know him from other things that we've talked about, including Black Sabbath. He worked with Judas Priest to a great degree, pretty much ever since 1979, all the way up through Firepower. He worked with Y&T. He worked with Kix, Def Leppard, on Through the Night. So he has a pretty prolific catalog when it comes to some of the bands that we talk about on a regular basis. So 7th album, basically pretty long into their career at this point. And this would be what would be considered their biggest album to date. It reached gold status in the U.S., I think pretty much on the back of Screaming in the Night, which I think even if you haven't heard much of Crocus at all, that's one of those tracks that I think most people have heard. I would agree. This is probably their best album. I've heard a lot of their stuff over the years. This is a band that unfortunately has some, back and forth membership. You have members that have multiple tenures in the band, like Chris Von Rohr. You have Fernando von Arb has multiple. Mark Starachi has left and come back. So, it's sometimes when your band has so much change in membership, it's hard to stay consistent. God, man, there's like 30 plus people on their roster over the years.
They're not L.A. Guns, are they?
Actually, yeah, like L.A. Guns is listed as a member. No, but I think Crocus has some really good stuff, and I would definitely like take a look or listen through a bit of their catalog. But for me, this is honestly one of their, if not their best album. I think it kind of hits that mainstream appeal to some degree, where you've got songs like Headhunter, the title track, Screaming in the Night, Eat the Rich, Stayed Awake All Night, and that's a cover of a Bachman Turner Overdrive song, and they do it to great effect. So I like a lot of the stuff that's here, and it's probably more cohesive than a lot of the stuff that came out before. But this was also their first kind of like major mainstream album in the U.S. So what do you think of Crocus Headhunter?
So I'm going to be honest. I've heard Long Stick Goes Boom. I've heard Screaming in the Night. I think that's a fabulous song. I love that song. I've heard them do American Woman, and I've heard their greatest hits. Mm-hmm. But I had never heard this album as a whole until the other day. And I actually paid attention to it for the most part. And the one thing that I kept prevailing to me when I'm listening to it is like his vocals have this familiarity to someone I know. And I could not pinpoint which singer he sounds like. Now, obviously, the biggest thing that he gets is that he sounds like Bon Scott. But he has this thing about like sounding like Bon Scott mixed with the dude from Jackal. I can't remember his name now off the top of my head. And that all that like Udo, he has this remnants of Udo and Mark Tornillo. It's all sounds like that, but maybe a little bit smoother, so closer to a Bon Scott. And I just kept listening to it. I'm like, man, this guy sounds so familiar. And I've heard them before, but there was just, I kept trying to figure out who is it that he sounds closer to. Could not for the life of me figure it out.
That could be because that was a kind of prevailing sound in European metal.
Well, it was more about they sound so much like, if you listen to Long Stick Goes Boom, I mean, that is an AC/DC song.
Oh, yeah.
Waiting to be given to AC/DC. But his voice,
I think he's been compared a lot to Bon Scott and probably like Robert Plant.
See, I don't get the Robert Plant thing, but I can see that though. But to me, Robert Plant's just so much smoother. He's got such a cool voice.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I did enjoy the album a lot. I mean, they had some really cool songs on there. I thought it was a very good album. I mean, like I said, I love Screaming in the Night. It's just a really, really good album to me. I wish that I probably had listened to it sooner because, in all honesty, this is a really good album. Eat the Rich is a cool song. Headhunter, I mean, it's got double bass, sort of like Overkill from Motorhead, that style. So, side 2 probably not as strong, but still, I think side 1 was a stronger side when you're looking at the whole thing as an album, but it's still overall very good album. And I was like, man, I wish I would have caught this sooner, like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but.
I had this album for a while. I think it was kind of on the back of, I heard their version of Ballroom Blitz.
Oh, that's the other song, Ballroom Blitz.
Well, that was on their next album that would come out in '84.
Mm-hmm.
So I had heard that, and I thought it was really cool. So I had a list of bands that I had to find something from, and I usually looked for like their greatest hits just so I had something, because CD stores back then with metal was sometimes difficult to find full catalogs, and so I went looking for something from Crocus, and the only thing that I found at that point was the album that came after, which I really wish I could remember the name.
The album that came after?
Yeah,
Headhunter?
That followed Headhunter.
The Blitz?
Oh, duh. Ballroom Blitz, The Blitz, yeah. So that was the only one that I could find, and the album cover had this woman, and draped in cloth that was basically naked behind it. And of course, as a teenage boy, I was like, "Yep, gotta buy that one."
The next album is pretty cool because it had Midnight Maniac, which is a really good song too.
Yeah.
And it produced by Bruce Fairbairn and engineered by our friend Bob Rock. So there you have that.
Our frenemy.
A friend of, well, he's my friend. I don't have a problem with him. Yeah, all the other Metallica fans can have a problem with him. I don't. But that's just the way I am. Okay.
All right. What you got?
All right. Up next for me is going to be this little band from Los Angeles, California. It goes by the name of Motley Crue.
All right.
They released their second album, Shout at the Devil, on September 26, 1983, on Elektra Records. It was recorded at Cherokee Recording Studios in Hollywood, California, produced by Tom Werman. All right, so Motley Crue comes on my radar with this album. And Looks That Kill is all over MTV. And it's all over MTV, all over. And then all of a sudden they released Too Young to Fall in Love. That video, I think they played it 3 to 4 times more than they played Looks to Kill. That song was on every single 2 minutes. It was incredible. The song was longer than they kept showing it every time in the middle of the song they would start over. I'm just kidding. It was just insane how much they were playing Too Young to Fall in Love. But here's so interesting thing. So they put 3 singles from this album. They put out Helter Skelter. I have the single. Now that's a physical copy single. I don't think they did a video for Helter Skelter, but they put a single out. It was a 12-inch picture disc single that had Live Wire and Take Me to the Top remixed, or was it the original Leather Record? I think it may have been the original Leather Record mixes that were on there. And I was so excited to jump all over that because I had heard about the first album being, independently released and then picked up by Elektra and remixed and all that shit. But to listen to that version on there that had the cowbell at the end with clapping on Livewire instead of the silence in between the cowbells and the drum breakdown at the end, it was so cool to listen to that and say, oh wow, this is what they sounded like, a few years ago. It was different. I was always into the different kind of mixes and little nuances of studio work. But I still have that, and it comes with a poster, and it's like worth a bunch of money now. Motley Crue was just they cemented themselves in the lexicon of American heavy metal music at that time, and it was for a couple of different reasons. One, the infamy on the Ozzy tour that happened with them and Ozzy on the Bark at the Moon tour. Obviously, they're still talking about that today. They still tell stories about the snorting the ants and all the cocaine and all the stuff that happened in that time period. Ozzy could deny it all he wants, but I don't think Ozzy's denying. Who was it? It was Jakey Lee who says, I don't remember that happening. Because Jake was probably up in the hotel playing his guitar while these guys were out there snorting ants on the pool. So one other thing that happened, and they could thank the PMRC for this, was PMRC wanted to start labeling albums. Well, they picked out Motley Crue, and they picked out Shout at the Devil, but they didn't do a warning sticker like the way they have now, because at that time they hadn't agreed upon that. So it wasn't a parental advisory, explicit lyrics kind of thing. It had a little tiny label that was the same color as all the writing on the back of the album. And it said, caution, this record may contain backwards messages. Are you kidding me? I mean, first of all, instantaneously, I'm going to buy this because I want to hear what's backwards. Okay? That's the first thing. Second thing, if you had been up to date on any of the things that were going on with the backward masking, you definitely wanted to buy the record because, you were feeling like, oh, you were going to get this special message. No, none of that shit exists in this album. It was made up by the PMRC thinking that they had something in nothing. It's a freaking good metal album. That's all it is.
Yeah. I mean, the PMRC did not exactly have kosher tactics in the way they were trying to adjust things. And honestly, it boosted the sales of the albums that they were trying to take down. You tell somebody, you can't have this, what do people want? That thing.
Exactly.
Dumbest crap ever, man. Like, really, like, and the stuff that came, the making fun of the PMRC after was just gold, honestly.
What were your thoughts on the album?
I mean, it's as far as Motley Crue, it's probably their best album. Just the list of songs that are on it: "Looks the Kill," "Shout at the Devil." I'm not as big a fan as Helter Skelter, but that's a classic cover, honestly. Too Young to Fall in Love, absolute classic. It's debatable among the fandom. Like, I think a lot of people think Too Fast for Love is their best album, which I would probably agree, but it's a tough one. But this one's definitely up there.
Okay, I mean that's fair enough. I mean, it's my favorite Motley Crue album for sure, absolutely. Too Fast for Love is good, but it's such a different album, and yes, it's more glam than this one, because this one's got such a hard edge to it. I mean, you could hear it in Vince's vocals. Mm-hmm. There's an angriness to this album that is really, really.
I think it's some of Vince's best vocals.
Yeah, it's so relatable in many ways, and through all the stuff that they went through, and just it comes across so genuine, in that regards.
It didn't come across as genuine in 97 when they did Shout at the Devil 97. That sucked.
I actually have no problem with that song.
It's like they took one of the songs that because it's got that in the background, mm-hmm. Going over everything. It sounds like they took the sound off of something from the Motley Crue album and just put it over the top of Shout at the Devil. Trying to sound edgier.
Oh, yeah, they were trying to sound, new metal. They were trying to sound was not so much new metal, but there was a kind of a combination of new metal industrial. That's what it was. So
yeah,
it didn't work, but I didn't have a problem with the song. I mean, I was looking at it as, this is an industrial version of the song. It doesn't bother me. But as far as being a Motley Crue, that wasn't Motley Crue. To me, that was just like a remix, even though it was a re-recording, technically.
Yeah, we need to talk about Generation Swine in more depth at some point.
No, we don't need to waste that time. Okay, what's your next album?
All right. Where'd my list go? All right, so my next album, I'm going to talk about Melissa from Merciful Fate. So released on October 30th of 1983 on Roadrunner Records, recorded at Easy Sound Recording in Copenhagen, Denmark, and produced by Henrik Lund. So as mentioned, I mean, this is a Danish album. This is the first album from Merciful Fate, although they had their EP before that, which was Merciful Fate, that I believe is also known as Nuns Have No Fun. Are those the same thing, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So Melissa was one that went under the radar for me for many years. Like, I had heard Metallica's compilation of Merciful Fate, and I wasn't really into it, honestly. That was one of the tracks on that album that just never clicked with me for some reason. But when we first started doing this podcast, you made me listen to Merciful Fate, and I really got into them, and this has since become a favorite of mine. This is my favorite Merciful Fate album. But, I mean, it's an absolute classic. So this band would spawn the career of King Diamond. King Diamond would go on to have his own solo career as well, but he's since come back and done, multiple stints with Merciful Fate, and the two are just intrinsically linked together. They're always going to be. For me, this is like a rawer sound than some of the stuff that they would become more refined as time goes on. One thing I think is kind of amazing is you have, Hank Sherman and Michael Denner on guitar, and they just kept coming up with riff ideas, and they just kept adding them to some of the songs. Like, so you have Satan's Fall, and Satan's Fall was, I believe, was almost completely composed by Hank Sherman, and he keeps coming up with riff ideas, and it stays interesting through the whole course of 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Some people say, well, it's not as refined, it's not as good as Don't Break the Oath, which was their second album, but I would disagree. There's something just magic on this album throughout the whole thing. To me, Evil is just such a perfect opening. Curse of the Pharaohs is such a great song. Into the Coven. Into the Coven was one of the ones that made it to the Filthy 15, correct?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, so then there's surprisingly not Satan's Fall,
Yeah, go figure.
Right? But then you have At the Sound of the Demon's Bell, Black Funeral. Black Funeral was a rework of an earlier song that they had, and then Melissa is such an odd song to something very different than the rest of the album, but still fits in very well. 7 tracks, to me, not a skippable one. I mean, the whole album's great from beginning to end. What do you think?
This is absolutely a classic album. I love a lot of songs. I mean, it's got 7 songs. I pretty much like all of them, but I'm probably more partial to 5 of them over Melissa, Say, and At the Sound of the Demon Bell, only because those are probably my least played. Mm-hmm. For all the stuff I listen to. But, the Evil, Curse of the Pharaohs, Into the Coven, Black Funeral, even Black Masses. I had that on a single, a picture disc single back when I was a kid. Satan's Fall. I mean, it's just really good songs, great riffs. I mean, that's what it is. This is just, if you look at Metallica's Injustice for All, this is the blueprint for something like that. It's just a cornucopia of riffs. That is just riffs galore.
Cornucopia.
You like that, huh?
Yeah.
It's a big word, like gymnasium. So, it's an absolute classic. Now, funny thing is, the song "Dangerous Meeting" is the first song that I heard off of "Don't Break the Oath," and then I went backwards and I listened to Melissa, and I ended up picking it up at the record store for like a cutout price, bargain bin price, like $5 or something like that. But it's still it's an original Roadrunner. Actually, it's not even Roadrunner. My copy is a Megaforce Records licensed copy, and so it's pretty cool. Even though now it's been re-released on Metal Blade, they have the relationship with Metal Blade, and Metal Blade bought all the tapes. But I mean, just an outstanding album. And one thing that's really curious to me, and it's I don't know if it's the timing thing, but this is 1983. This is their first album. This is their debut album. Now, mind you, they did release, the Merciful Fate EP, otherwise known as Nuns Have No Fun. So there was that out there. But the thing about that is that came out at the end of 1982. So it's only a few months old at this point. At this point, they have influenced so many of the metal bands that made up the thrash scene that it's so weird. Like Lars Ulrich was very familiar with them at this point. I mean, only been around for a year, barely, and they were so influential on that thrash scene. It's almost mind-boggling to think that the short period of time that they were there, they had such a huge impact. But
they were one of those bands that not just had the sound, but they had an image that people were scared by. I mean, there were people in their country that were like, we can't listen to this because you're Satanists, and he had to dispute that the music had nothing to do with that. It was about mythology.
It's kind of hard to dispute that when the song's called Satan's Fall.
No, but it's about context, because they ended up writing songs about other kind of stuff that was occult but not necessarily specifically about Satanism. They kind of pushed away from that because specifically King noticed like maybe we should do something different because the point is not Satanism, the point is occultism. So
right, absolutely. No, but one of my favorite albums out there, that's for sure.
All right, so moving on, what do you got next?
All right, I have one of two thrash metal giants and their debut release. This is Slayer with Show No Mercy, released on December 3rd, 1983 on Metal Blade Records. Recorded at Track Record Studios in L.A. and produced by Slayer and Brian Slagel. Brian Slagel, he's a very important figure in the career of Metallica, Slayer, Lizzie Borden, and a lot of the bands that came, a lot of the harder bands, Armored Saint, a lot of the harder bands that came out of the LA area, and Metallica, even though they came out of the Bay Area, they started in LA, so that's how their friendship with Brian Slagel came about. So Slayer's album, Show No Mercy, was the second of the Big Four to release their debut album. Now, at this time, no one knew who the Big Four were. There wasn't such a thing called the Big Four. But it is the second band of the Big Four bands to release their debut album. And basically, it started out as, they were playing. Brian Slagel saw them and said, "Hey, would you guys be interested in putting a song on one of my compilation albums called Metal Massacre? I'm coming out with my third one. Would you like to be on it?" They said yes. They gave him a song, Aggressive Perfector. And through that buzz, they were playing around town, and Brian's like, "You guys are getting bigger. Would you like to do a record on Metal Blade?" And so they signed with Metal Blade, and they self-financed their debut album. Tom had some money saved from his job, and they borrowed the rest of the money from Kerry's dad, and they came up with Show No Mercy. This album did not hit my radar until after Rain and Blood came out.
Really?
I may have heard about it. I may have seen it, and I just wasn't into it because me and that whole satanic thing didn't really have a kosher relationship until a couple years later. But yeah, so that's how that ended up happening. I didn't get into it until much later. And again, I didn't get into Metallica until 85. So that's Metallica at that point being the fastest thing I heard. So yeah, that would perfectly line up with the fact that I got Slayer in 86 and with Rain and Blood, and I went backwards from there.
This is such a different album than stuff that would come later. I mean, it's almost like corny and cheesy to a degree, where it just sounds very like teenage angsty edgy at times, whereas Slayer would really mature into focusing on real world subjects,
sort of like that Pantera Metal Magic album.
Yeah, I mean, even the album cover I would put on par with the Metal Magic kind of stuff. A little better, honestly. At least the anatomy is a little better. The feet leave a little bit to be desired on this what is his name? Baphomet kind of looking dude.
Yeah, Baphomet.
He's a goat warrior, I guess. Has a kind of appeal. I would say, like, if you're familiar with 1980s, 1970s comic book, like Elric and stuff like that, that same kind of look of those warriors and Eternal Champion kind of stories, stuff like that. So there is that appeal. Like, I think a lot of the people that were into Dungeons and Dragons and that kind of stuff probably saw albums like this and went, this is for me. So I get that. The sound is very primitive. It's not recorded very well. They wouldn't really get into the great quality recording until Rain and Blood. But this album is a classic in its own right. There's with those first couple albums from any of the thrash bands, I think there is a bit of magic there, because there is that hungriness, that need to put out the music that they wanted to and that they believed in. And I think Show No Mercy definitely shows that. I mean, I really like the song Show No Mercy. Die by the Sword is pretty cool. Tormentor, and then Aggressive Perfector, which is on the re-release that you mentioned before, is also kind of a classic. I think it ended up on, what was it, the Haunting the Chapel EP.
That song is on like 9 different albums.
Oh, I'm sure.
In 9 different versions. Like they kept it was on Metal Massacre. They didn't put it on this one, but they put it on the re-release. They put it on the EP, but then it wasn't on the EP. They put it on the Live Undead, but then it really wasn't. That's right. Okay. And then it really wasn't on. They did a live version, but then there was actually a studio version, because my version of Live Undead is completely different than the one that's in Wikipedia, which is really weird. And then the CD that I have is different than the vinyl that I have. It's more in line with what's in Wikipedia. And then they released Aggressive Perfector as a B-side to one of the singles off of South of Heaven, and it's like it's a completely different version. It's like they re-recorded like for a third time or something like that. It's just so weird, but its song keeps just popping up everywhere.
I think Slayer's just one of those bands that increased their quality as time went on. I mean, 85's Hell Awaits I think is a bit better than Show No Mercy, and then obviously Rain and Blood, South of Heaven, and Seasons of the Abyss are just classics in their own right. That entire like batch of time. Mm-hmm. So for me, I mean, that's the era of Slayer that I really like. That stuff before, and then it wasn't until Christ Illusion, I would say, that I got back into them. So I mean, that took a long time for them to kind of get
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Show No Mercy is a solid start. I think it's a classic album, and it's not exactly where they would go, but it's definite start. You can kind of see the direction that they would grow into.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's definitely the beginning of something. You could tell. As their career progressed, you could tell that this was just something that started them and kickstarted the whole thing. From that point forward, really cool.
Think about this. Like the label expected them to sell about 5,000 albums, and that's really where they were at that time. Like they expected pretty much all of their releases to sell about 5,000 albums, and it sold 3 to 4 times that amount. Just in that time period of 1983. So that's pretty impressive. Like I think people were craving this kind of stuff, and this was a great example of it.
Oh, absolutely. And so a really cool tidbit on this is that Gene Hoglan was associated with the band. He was hanging out with them. I believe he was teching for Dave Lombardo. Not like, a drum tech does now. He was more like, helping them out when they did shows. And he wanted to be on the album. He's like, oh, they're recording an album. I want to be on it. And so they decided that they were going to do big gang vocals for the evil part, the part where they go, evil has no boundaries. And so he was like the first one to raise his hand. I want to do it. So he's on the album, singing background vocals during the gang vocal part on Evil Has No Boundaries.
You know what's funny? So there's a lot of uncredited stuff like that in the music industry. Like somebody will just walk in and record, something on an album. So my audio teacher was the drummer for a band called Head East. And I'm not super familiar with them myself, other than he mentioned them, when he was in there. And like one day when they were recording, the Eagles walked in, and they asked him, do you want to record the background vocals, or would you record background vocals with us? And they were like, sure. And they just did that on the album. I've heard stories like that on multiple occasions where it's like somebody just walks into the studio and they're like, hey, wanna be on the album? So that's kind of cool.
Can I get a point? No. Sorry.
Yeah.
So anyhow, we mentioned earlier the PMRC on the Motley Crue album. On this one, the PMRC stuck their nose into it again, and they actually sent a letter to Slayer.
Not a letter.
A letter. Handwritten. I don't know if it was handwritten. It's probably typed. They sent a letter to Slayer asking them to stop releasing records. it's like, wait a second, this is our first one. But, so it's amazing what these people thought they could do. And
please stop and think of the children.
Exactly. If anyone's interested in that episode about the PMRC, it was called The Filthy 15. It was episode 121. So it's not that far back. So take a listen to it.
That was a pretty fun episode, honestly.
No, that was a pretty fun episode. All right. So you got one final album you want to talk about. What is that album?
I'm going to talk about the band that's pretty unknown. They're called Iron Maiden.
Who?
Yeah, I'd never heard of them before this, honestly. So they released Peace of Mind, which was their first album with new drummer Nico McBrain. Prior to this, obviously, had been some lineup changes. Their first album with singer Bruce Dickinson was the prior album, Number of the Beast. And before that, they had their, falling out with their previous singer, Paul Di'Anno, and had replaced, like I mentioned, this was the first album with Nico McBrain. Prior to that, they had Clive Burr on drums. So a couple lineup changes at this point, but this is where they settle into their classic lineup. Peace of Mind came out on May 16th, 1983 on Capitol Records and EMI Records worldwide. Recorded at Compass Point Studios in Nassau in the Bahamas. And this was perverted. Wow. This was produced by Martin Birch, also known as...
He was a bad influence.
Black Knight. So this was a absolute classic album that came out. Starting off with Where Eagles Dare, Revelations, Flight of Icarus, Die With Your Boots On, The Trooper, Still Life, Quest for Fire, Sun and Steel, and To Tame a Land. How do you release a 45-minute album with a song that does not miss? Well, that's what Iron Maiden was doing at this time. One thing that they became with Bruce was a little bit more mature in their songwriting. For better or worse. I know there's a lot of people that only think of the first two albums from Iron Maiden as classic albums, and they don't want to listen to anything with Bruce. I completely disagree. I think he really elevated them to another level. This was really at the point where they were starting to get big, like starting with Number of the Beast. Number of the Beast. I don't know what I said with the Beast. That's weird. So Number of the Beast and Peace of Mind just kind of blew them up into another level. Obviously, they already had their club scene. They grew from there. Things got bigger and bigger. Iron Maiden became one of the biggest names in metal, but they weren't progressing, and they weren't happy with the lineup. They thought, this is time to move on, and clearly, I think they made the right move. There's some interesting stuff, like there's the hidden message at the beginning of Still Life, as a joke, on these, satanic accusations of like basically the same stuff that the PMRC was doing, just saying like, this is stupid. So, what was the line that was the backwards message on there? Do you remember?
Something with the king with tree bonds. Don't meddle with things you don't understand.
Yeah, so which is hilarious because they're just basically saying like, you're an idiot. to the people that are accusing them of being satanic.
Well, it's funny because on Number of the Beast, they put a quote from Revelations about, woe to you, O earth and sea. It was put on the album. It was actually recorded, and then they pressed it on the back of the part of the graphics. And then on this one, they did the same thing, but instead of saying, I think it was the word rain on it, they put the word brain because of the whole peace of mind thing, and they had Eddie's brain sitting in the middle of the table. So they totally changed the complete meaning of that Bible verse, and it just had everybody up in arms that was Bible related. And it's like, you people just don't get it at all, but whatever.
Yeah. The thought of a band like Iron Maiden being satanic is just amusing to me because it's more about the theatrical. Like, I always thought of their music as more of like watching a horror movie. You're watching Dracula. I don't go like, oh my God, Dracula's going to come get me if I'm not a good boy. Like, first of all, he's after girls. But but regardless, like, I never had those kind of thoughts. I always saw this as just fantasy. And I understand that if you're so wrapped up in certain thought processes and you can't see beyond like the fantasy aspect of it, I guess I get that. But at the same time, just as a kid, I thought this stuff was so intriguing, just so interesting. Like the character of Eddie to me was as iconic as any Frankenstein or Wolfman or anything like that. I just thought it was, interesting, like some kind of creature almost.
Yeah. No, I mean, I get it. There's so much blown out of proportion when it comes to Iron Maiden, and you just laugh at it. It's like, come on, people. If you really, really think that this is the way that Iron Maiden are, you seriously have some problems. Why is it that someone who's a kid can see right past it, but you, who are as an adult who is supposed to have a more advanced mind, can't see past your own freaking nose? I never understood that. That's what makes it's astonishing to me, that kind of closed-mindedness.
I mean, you have songs on there like "To Tame a Land," which is about Dune. So how do you go, well, they're obviously satanic because they're writing about a fantasy novel about sandworms?
Oh, the Flight of Icarus is about Icarus. Ooh, it's a Greek god, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, come on, people. They got offended with Revelations because there's something about Revelations. Well, it's a completely different thing. It has nothing to do with the Bible, book. And then Where Eagles Dare, about the movie, The Trooper. Come on, really.
Yeah. Just to briefly clarify, Icarus was not a god. He was a mortal who flew too close to the sun. But yes, a Greek myth.
Greek myth is what I meant to say.
Yes.
So, so this was the first Iron Maiden album that came out after I became a fan. So I was awaiting this album. I had mentioned that in the previous show before. The videos for Flight of Icarus, and then the video for The Trooper was just endless on MTV. And also I had a local high school that played a lot of videos. I mentioned that before on one of our previous episodes. And they played Flight of Icarus, The Trooper. They played Number of the Beast and Run to the Hills like it was going out of style every week, because their show was only on like twice a week. Every time they had their show on and played videos, those 4 videos were playing. And quite honestly, in my opinion, this and Power Slave are probably their 2 best sounding Iron Maiden albums to date. And I would actually put this one a little bit ahead in terms of sound quality. that's my opinion. I know not everyone agrees with that, but there's just something about the way the drums sound on this album. The everything just has that extra punch. Everything, the guitars are right in your face. The vocals are right there. You can hear the bass pretty clearly in just about every song. And it's one of those things where it's just like, it's near perfection. Number of the Beast is my favorite album overall because of the songs. But as far as the overall package, to me, Peace of Mind is near perfection.
So I was thinking about this the other day, and I really thought about it specifically because of an album you're going to mention in just a bit. Because I heard a version of a song, basically a band covered a musician, technically, just one guy on YouTube, covered a version of a new song that came out from the band you're going to talk about, and did it in the style of their first album. And I was like, I like this better than what I heard from the new version. I legitimately did. I was like, this is pretty incredible. And I thought about why. Like, why did I like it better? And it had to do with the distortion. It had to do with the recording style. But they made it sound like it came out in 1983. And I was like, I think I like bad recording to some degree. Not bad recording, but I like that sound of, like, analog recording better than I like the digital stuff. There's something about it feeling that warmth, right? Like, people always talk about how vinyl sounds better, and that's not necessarily true. I think a lot of people just like the sound of the hiss, and it sounds warm to them because it's something maybe nostalgic, and maybe that's true. So I think a lot of times, obviously, production is subjective. It can become too sterile. It can become like where it doesn't feel natural. Like, you have Eddie Van Halen removing the sounds of him sliding on his guitar. Things like that, where there is some charm to those aspects of music when you listen to them, where things sound more natural. There's the hiss. There's the sound of the fingers on the strings. There's the quality or capability of the recording equipment, and it just sounds like it sounds more authentic in some way rather than feeling sterile. It's like people have that argument when you go into a home where everything is straight lines. It feels like you're in a doctor's office rather than a home, and it's like, it's always subjective. It's your personal opinion on how it feels. So while you say, like, Peace of Mind, you say it has, like, the best production, has the best sound, I think it's subjective. But as far as having the cleanest sound, I would agree.
Well, I'm glad you brought that all up, because that's an argument that I've had, but with the person that I had it with, it was always, I don't want to hear it. And the conversation just kind of ended real quickly. So the band that you were referencing, that I'm going to talk about now, is Metallica. And Metallica released their debut album, Kill 'Em All, on July 25th, 1983, on Megaforce Records. We all kind of know that. It was recorded at Music America in Rochester, New York, and it was produced by Paul Curcio. So this is the first of the big four to release their debut albums. So real quick, most everyone who's a Metallica fan or a fan of metal kind of knows the general story. They were signed to Megaforce Records on the buzz of their demo, No Life Till Leather. They traveled all the way across the country to record their debut album for Johnny Z, because Brian Slagle of Metal Blade Records could not afford the $8,000 it was going to take to record the album, so he passed on it, and he regrets that to this day. But anyhow, Metallica went across the country. They went to New Jersey. They hooked up with Johnny Z, who was a record store owner, and I think it was Rock and Roll Heaven was the record store he owned. He told the band that he would help them record the record. He did, and they put it out on Megaforce Records. That was the first record released by Megaforce. That and Raven came out at the same time. It was kind of one of those weird things, but it was originally supposed to be Title Metal Up Your Ass, as everyone knows, and they changed it just so that they can make sure that they get stocked by the distributor. The reason why I say I'm glad you mentioned that production thing is I had this conversation with someone else, with a friend of mine, and we talked about how Metallica's Kill 'Em All sounds better than all the other big four albums. And I would almost say sounds better than all the other four albums combined. Okay. Megadeth sounds like shit. Anthrax is better than shit. And then Slayer's is relatively clear, but you could tell it's just low production. I mean, when you have to record the drums without cymbals and then add the cymbals in later, I don't know which one costs more. To go through and kind of suppress the cymbal sound in between tracks, or to actually have to physically go there and re-record all, or add the recording time. I don't know. That's what ended up happening. I listened to this record, and I listened to it on the Megaforce version on my stereo, and it punches just like the remastered version. It has that same punch on the drums. It has that same really loud crunch on the guitars. I mean, the weakest part of it is the vocals. Okay? You can hear the bass clearly throughout most of the album, right? Which is much to the dismay of Lars Ulrich, because he hates bass. But, I mean, I'm glad you said what you said about enjoying, I guess you could say, that kind of sound. Mm-hmm. Because I thought that sound, personally, I can listen to that album and have no problem. To me, it's one of the best sounding debut albums from an independent, minor, tiny little label that had no money to put into an album than just about anything out there. I mean, there's debut albums. You can't compare Guns N' Roses' major label debut to Kill 'Em All. But I listened to all, a lot of the raw stuff, not raw, but a lot of the older stuff that I have that's all debuts and independent record stuff. I mean, it's hard to compare. They did a great job on it.
Yeah, I mean, but again, yeah, it's subjective, but at the same time, like, there is a cleanness to it that nobody else was achieving. So it is pretty impressive.
I mean, I listen to major label debuts that don't sound that good. I mean, look at Testament's first album, Over the Legacy.
Yeah,
doesn't sound that good. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I'm looking at my record collection. I'm like, what else sounds like shit? So, I mean, I don't know. It's just one of those things where shit. And it sounds better to me. It sounds better than You Can't Stop Rock and Roll from Twisted Sister, because that sounds kind of muffly a little bit, So it's actually, put it this way. Under the Blade, to me, sounds better, but there's so much compression on the drums that it kind of kills the sound for the most part. But I mean, it's just done very well. And, a lot of people can argue with me all they want. That's just the way I feel about it. I don't know. It's like, it's a great sound. I mean, it definitely sounds... There's a reason why Metallica's where they're at, and it all started on this record. Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, it started even before it, technically, but yeah. This was the album that was massively available to the people, and it inspired, countless people to play just even a guitar. People to pick up a drum kit, people to pick up a bass. I mean, how many bass players have been inspired by Cliff Burton? So, obviously they have a huge impact on the metal world. They've kind of changed their style. So obviously they have fans that have really more gravitated to certain eras of the band, but that in and of itself, I think, is impactful too. Where they have different eras that appeal to different groups of people, so they can capture a wider net of fandom in some way. But to me, Kill 'Em All, top 4 album, obviously for me. Like, I'm only really a big fan of the first 4 albums. I like some of the stuff later, but those are my Metallica albums that I really enjoy. I can't remember where I placed it at the time, but it's for me, it's either 3 or 4 in their top albums, and that's still after all these years. So, absolute classic. Obviously, a lot of the stuff was planned before Cliff joined the band, and then the stuff was planned before Kirk joined the band. He was the last member of that lineup. And so you have a little bit different sound that comes from Ride the Lightning, because that was the first album that all 4 of those guys were really working together. But it's still a really, recognizable album. I think anybody hears any of those songs and instantly knows that it's Metallica. And even without it, even without having a heavy songwriting credit, Cliff had such an impact with just his Anesthesia track on there.
Oh, yeah. Look, we all know the story of how Cliff joined the band, because they saw him playing for Trauma, and, they needed a new bass player. They didn't want to fire Ron McGovney, but Ron McGovney knew he wasn't long for the band because he couldn't get along with Mustaine. Go figure. And so they got Cliff. But Cliff said, I'll join your band, but you got to move to San Francisco. And that's how badly they wanted him. They moved to San Francisco. So we all know the story. We all know that Mustaine got fired pretty much a couple days after they moved. They finally got to, New Jersey, and they put him on the bus and sent him back. All those things, one move after the next move after the next move, all brought them to where they are today. And, they are hands down my favorite band, and I am a Metallica apologist, all you want to accuse me about, but bottom line is, most of what is out there and most of what people complain about when it comes to what Metallica has done, not necessarily the songs that they've written and not necessarily the actions they have taken, in terms of creating a Saint Anger. It's just over the years, all the things that they've done, I would say most people would recognize that to be something that was good, and put it like that. I'm
not going to recognize Saint Anger as good.
No, I'm not talking about Saint Anger. I'm just saying, not necessarily the product, like the things that they've done. Like, as much as everyone says, oh, they should have never put out some kind of monster. You know what? It broke the doors open for a lot of different things. It just so happened to be that they did it publicly for things that were probably already happening behind the scenes that people didn't talk about. Sort of like, things need to be out in the open sometimes, and there's always someone. They were dead on correct when it came to Napster, but nobody wanted to put the fight up. They had the balls to do it. Did it work? Not necessarily.
The gates were already open. That was the thing. It didn't matter because it's never stopped anything. Even taking down Napster didn't stop anything. They weren't wrong, but the gates were already open and there was no close. It's like opening Pandora's box, right? Once it's open, it didn't close. So
right, but the unfortunate, it was already open, but the music industry was so far behind the times that their reactions were absolutely horrible. And there were ways that they could have made it where stuff like this, that the industry wouldn't have been in such peril because of it. But they were so out of touch, so out of date, and they did not listen to some of the artists, specifically Metallica, that that this is not the way it's supposed to go down. But unfortunately, it is what it is, and he's still. he still is bearing the brunt of that today, but everyone always says he was dead on right. It's just that no one was willing to speak up at that time. Sort of like Dee Snider when he went up in front of the PMRC. No one else, except for him, John Denver, and Frank Zappa, had the balls to stand there and say something against these people. Because they all thought that their livelihoods were going to be, taken away.
It just comes off a little differently to some people, right? Because Metallica was making money hand over fist, and everybody knew that. So, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that's just perception, right? So people go, "Oh, millionaires losing money," but it's not the same for everybody, because it wasn't just about Metallica; it was about other bands, right? So like people that are not making millions of dollars from their releases were affected in the same way, and even more so, because not everybody has the licensing capabilities of Metallica. Not everybody can create their own, alcohol. Not everybody can create their own, what doesn't Metallica license? They're on the same level as Kiss now. Yeah, right? Like there's probably a Metallica thong somewhere out there, I'm assuming. So,
well, along those lines, right? The biggest thing that I always see, like, I've read an article. Well, Metallica sued this makeup company because they had an eyeshadow named Metallica, and it was said by, I forgot who I was reading talked about it. Mm-hmm. That I think it was JJ French from Twisted Sister. The unfortunate part is if you don't sue, what happens is you lose the ability to sue later.
Yep. You have to set a precedent. And when somebody's going to possibly damage your IP, it doesn't matter. You have to take care of that. So it's not about like some, they're just trying to take down some makeup company. What if the makeup company puts out Metallica, whatever, and then, people start wearing it and their faces break out and they're permanently scarred by it. Like that's their IP, that's their bread and butter, that's their livelihood. They cannot allow them to do those kind of things. So it is always funny to me how people will go like, "Oh, the big guy's just trying to take on the little guy." No, they have earned everything that they have, like it or not, and that's just a fact. You have to protect the IP of what you are what makes you your money, what makes your livelihood.
Right. And what's the biggest thing about all that? Control. And that was really, everyone talks about, Metallica had millions. They didn't have to sue Napster, blah, 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 blah. It wasn't about money. Never was about money. It was about control. How they were in the recording studio with an unfinished product and that got on the radio without their permission. It's about control. That's all it was about. And how they are able to disseminate their product. Mm-hmm. Okay? If you take that away from any artist, they're all going to fucking lose their shit. Okay? And that's what ended up happening to a lot of different artists, because then once they were unable to have that control, then that's when it started affecting livelihoods. So that's what it was all about. And people, want to sit there and complain, well, they had all sorts of money. Nah, it's not about the fucking money. Okay, it was about control.
It's not easy to always explain that to everyone because, again, perception is reality, right? And that's a term we've brought up many times, where people see it in a certain way, and it doesn't matter if that's the case or not. They're just going to see it how they want to see it because, well, let's just face it, a lot of people are narcissistic these days and only see how things affect them. But, that's a story for another time.
Yes, absolutely. So while we're on the subject of these albums that came out in 1983, before we head into our big four, we're just going to list a few records that came out this year, 1983 as well. We're not going to go into any depth about them for the most part, but I'll just name off a few, then you can pick up a few for yourself, Chris.
Okay.
AC/DC came out with Flick of the Switch, Except with Balls to the Wall. We kind of mentioned early on in the episode, Alcatraz had had formed this year. Alcatraz was formed, like we said, was Graham Bonnet. It had Yngwie Malmsteen on guitar. Another band, I'll put this in conjunction with Alcatraz. Another band that also formed this year was a band called Steeler that was fronted by Ron Keel. Yngwie Malmsteen came over from Sweden, was hooked up with Ron Keel. They made their first album for Steeler, and immediately upon the album's release, basically, or even before the release of the album, Yngwie had left to join Alcatraz, and then immediately upon that, I think he may have even gone on tour with them. Yngwie ended up leaving and basically doing his own thing after that. Anvil, Forged in Fire. So actually, I meant to say, Alcatraz released their album No Parole from Rock and Roll this year. Anvil, Forged in Fire, Armored Saints' first EP. The Armored Saint EP was released on Metal Blade. And we talked about Black Sabbath. One huge album that we didn't talk about that came out this year, Def Leppard's Pyromania. That stayed in my boombox for quite a long time, especially songs like Photograph and Rock of Ages. What albums you got?
Did you mention All for One by Raven?
I did not, because Raven's on the R section. I'm still in the B. I'm in the D's.
Gotcha. Okay, so there was All for One by Raven, which I think to this day, to me, is their best album. You have See You in Hell by Grim Reaper. One band we've never talked about, which I think is kind of a very influential band in the scene, but maybe not in the fan base out there, is Manila Road released Crystal Logic, which was, I believe, their third album. That's one I think we should talk about it in some capacity at some point. Manila Road is one of those very overlooked American metal bands. You already said Def Leppard's Pyromania. What about, did you mention Bark at the Moon by Ozzy?
I did not get to the O section.
I mean, that's a pretty massive one. I mean, that's first album after Randy Rhoads' passing. This album was 100% written by Ozzy.
Ooh, I did not know that he was so prolific at songwriting.
Yeah, he was like, he picked up a guitar and a bass, and he was like, I'm going to write all this.
That was the most amazing thing about that, because I swear to God, we talked about this when we compared The Ultimate Sin to Bark at the Moon. We did the head-to-head. I remember distinctly to this day picking up the record, Bark at the Moon, and seeing all songs written by Ozzy Osbourne. And I'm like, really? And I don't know anything. I'm 14 years old. I don't know anything about Ozzy couldn't write a freaking note. Right. But I just found it so unusual that the first two albums had all sorts of contributions by the full band. Right. Mm-hmm. But this album that had Jakey Lee, this monstrous guitar player, had, it had Tommy Aldridge on drums, even though, what's his face, Carmine Appice played, or was on the video. Bob Daisley was on it. How was it that none of these guys had any input on the songwriting? I was just flabbergasted,
because Ozzy all of a sudden just gained this magic ability.
That is something that will stand out in my mind forever. Oh, what else came out?
So there was Saxon's Power and Glory, or Power and the Glory, I should say. Then there's Manowar Into Glory Ride. Let's see, what else?
We got to talk about Manowar soon.
Yeah. I make jokes about Virgin Steel all the time, but one of their better albums, Guardians of the Flame, actually came out that year. That's a band that's really interesting to talk about, and to some degree flies under the radar, but that's one that we're gonna have to definitely do something with. Rat released their Rat EP in 1983, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then Suicidal Tendencies with their self-titled album as well.
And that was a landmark debut album for Suicidal.
I mentioned earlier Eliminator by ZZ Top, not necessarily a metal album, but hugely influential and just a fantastic album.
Dokken released their debut record, Breaking the Chains, and almost got dropped by Elektra, but then they convinced them to give them one more shot, and they came up with Tooth and Nail, and they were able to expand on their record deal. So that was a pretty good deal that they worked out there.
That's crazy to me that they were almost dropped after breaking the chains.
I don't think they generated the buzz like all the other LA bands did.
But they had that awesome music video where they were busting the chains in a dungeon.
No, they were breaking the chains.
I know, it's a synonym.
I know. Anyhow.
I see what you did there.
Breaking the chains.
Any others that you can think of?
Y&T, Mean Streak, Triumph, Never Surrender, Sabotage, another metal band that's grossly underappreciated by you and I on this show. Release Sirens, Lita Ford, Out for Blood, Europe's first album, Europe. And there's a bunch of others that came out. Check out the list on Wikipedia if you want. And then finally, there were a couple live albums, but the most notable was Thin Lizzy Live. And then a couple compilation albums. Metal Massacre 3 and 4 came out in this year in 1983. Metal Massacre 3 featured Slayer's Aggressive Perfector, where Metal Massacre 4 featured Lizzie Borden's Rod of Iron. So there was a lot of good stuff in 1983. I tell you, it was a landmark year for metal. It was really, really important. So check out a lot of these titles when you get a chance, if you have not already, because most of you should already have. But I know there's a lot of young cats out there that haven't gotten on the bandwagon yet, and you got to listen to some stuff, man. All right, well, that brings us to our big four albums of 1983, and it's chosen by us, and so that's our individual favorites, what we think are the big four albums for this year. So I believe you went first last week, so I think I'll go first this week.
That works for me.
All right, so my big four albums, and man, I had a hard time picking because there was just so many good albums for me. I'm a more mainstream guy, much more than you are, but I had to throw in an honorable mention in there real quick. It was Motley Crue, Shout at the Devil. But number 4 for me was Dio's Holy Diver. It was just... there was something impactful about that. Just seeing that guy, a little tiny guy, coming out of the Renaissance forest. It was it was just one of those things that I thought it was really cool. I really think that album is very influential. I mean, Vivian Campbell, cemented his place in metal history. And it was just very, it's a veteran act with a very young guitar player, and they did a really good job of putting everything together. Number 3 for me, we briefly mentioned it a few minutes ago, Def Leppard's Pyromania. I it's like there was a rotation of albums, Shout at the Devil, Bark at the Moon, Def Leppard. I mean, I didn't know anything about Metallica at this point in 1983, so I wasn't a fan yet. AC/DC's Flick of the Switch, all these albums were on my stereo, but Def Leppard was one of those that we heard all day long, every day during the summer, because so many people were into it and they just wanted to hear Photograph. And then Rock of Ages came out and the video on MTV was just nuts. Number 2 for me is Iron Maiden's Peace of Mind. We've already kind of gone over that one. It's not my favorite, but it's way up there in terms of my Iron Maiden albums. So it's my number 2 1983 album. And if you already didn't know what number 1 was going to be, I'll give you the surprise. Spoiler alert, Metallica's Kill 'Em All. So, what is your big 4?
I'm absolutely shocked that Metallica was your number 1.
You're as shocked as I was when I saw Gene Simmons' face.
Maybe more so, but
shocking.
So we actually do have quite a bit of crossover. We have 3 albums that crossed over.
Oh, wow.
It's hard to not pick some of these because they are that good. My number 4 is Holy Diver by Dio. Absolutely fantastic album. Like you said, Dio's just iconic. He really is, and he's cemented his legacy every incarnation of what he did. His stuff in Rainbow, his stuff in Black Sabbath and Dio, everything. And then even just his contribution to Jack Black's movie, the Pick a Destiny. Like, it's just so iconic. Dio's one of those guys, and this album to me is one of the most solid that Dio released. My number 3 is your number 1, Kill 'Em All by Metallica. I used to be, when I was much younger, just a massive fan of Metallica, so this had such an impact on me, got me to listen to a lot of other bands. This was, like I said, one of my favorites, still my top 4 Metallica albums. I kind of dropped off of them later, which we've discussed before, but this one will always remain a classic to me and one of my favorites of that band. Anything with Cliff on it to me was just phenomenal. My number 2, Melissa by Merciful Fate. It's one of those albums that I listened to later in life, but it really grew on me, has become one of my favorite albums, period. I've got it framed on my wall. Evil is just one of those tracks that I constantly go back to, absolutely love. And my number 1 is going to be a shocker to everyone, in the same way that yours was a shocker. Peace of Mind by Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden, as many of you know, is one of, if not my favorite metal band, and Peace of Mind is up there. It's not my favorite album by the band by any means. It might be 4th or 5th in their collection, but
your favorite is X Factor, isn't it?
Absolutely. Anything with X in the title is tops to me.
So you like both X Factor and Virtual 11 because there's an X in the 11.
Yeah, if they could have just thrown X's in all the titles of everything going forward, and yeah, absolutely. No, neither of those are even in my top. They're probably the bottom 2, but there are a couple good songs on both of those albums, but that's not what we're focusing on here. Peace of Mind, for every reason we mentioned earlier. Absolutely fantastic album. It's one of those that just doesn't miss from beginning to end. Something about it just doesn't resonate with me as strong as, say, Power Slave, or even Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. Somewhere in Time, either my first or second favorite, depending on my mood. So yeah, it's just how does a 4th or 5th favorite album from a catalog make it to number 1 slot? It just means they've got that many good albums. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I like your list because you got 3 out of mine 4. But like I said, it was really difficult to really put them in a particular order that was going to suffice. I mean, obviously, I knew Metallica was going to be number 1, and I knew Iron Maiden was going to be number 2. The question was, how did I fill out the other 2 spots? That's why I had to mention something about Motley Crue, because that was a pretty big album for me back then. So,
I mean, bands that are on that list, in a few years' time might make it higher to the top with other releases. Like, man, we got to do 86 at one point, with the impact of 86, so many amazing albums. But yeah, like, these early albums didn't necessarily make it to number 1, but the iconicness and just staying power of all these bands that we talked about, it's continues on for many, many years, even till to this day. So.
Yep. I mean, all these albums have turned 40 this year, so go out and listen to them when you get a chance. Enjoy it, because these are classic albums. Most every single one of these are some sort of classic. All right, well, that's our big 4 albums for 1983, and I just want to remind everyone to tell your friends about us and click the subscribe button wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.
And don't forget to leave us a comment on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or send us an email to debatingmetal@gmail.com. YouTube viewers, click subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when we post a new episode. So remember to tune in next week when we spark up another exciting metal debate. On behalf of Kenneth and myself, stay safe and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.